There are lots of different ways that organisms interact with each other in their environment. Most often, though, their interactions involve the most critical task of staying alive, obtaining energy through food. Being able to describe these relationships that are formed in an organism's quest for energy really comes down to knowing the language of biology. Each relationship is described with one or two particular vocabulary words that place that organism within a certain role in its environment. After you record the essential question in your notes, we'll take a look at the vocabulary that describes these important roles. Without energy, there could be no life. Maintaining life on Earth requires a continual input of energy from the sun. Energy from the sun travels through a number of different organisms in a food chain. Plants, algae, and some bacteria can convert light energy from the sun into usable chemical energy. This process is called photosynthesis. These types of organisms are called primary producers. Because we live in terrestrial biomes, or on land, we think of producers as just plants. But we should not forget the microscopic phytoplankton that is found in the ocean, these little guys over here. They're responsible for about 60% of the oxygen produced on the planet and are a critical base for the marine ecosystems of the ocean. Primary producers are also called autotrophs because they produce their own food. Auto refers to self, and troph refers to feeding. So autotrophs are self-feeders. Consumers, also called heterotrophs, are organisms that obtain their energy by eating other organisms. Different types of heterotrophs are classified according to what they eat. Herbivores eat producers. The root herb refers to plants. Herbivores are primary consumers because they are the first consumer level in a food chain. Examples of common primary consumers that often pop into our minds are rabbits, squirrels, cows. In the ocean, however, zooplankton, microscopic tiny animals, are an important primary consumer. The next level of consumers, called secondary consumers, eats the primary consumers. Secondary consumers are also called carnivores because they eat other animals. The root or prefix carn refers to meat. Think of a carniceria if you speak Spanish. Some common secondary consumers that we often think of are things like wolves and lions, like this one here. A consumer that eats secondary consumers is a tertiary or third level consumer. Snakes and hawks are often tertiary consumers in a food chain. Omnivores are a unique group of consumers because they eat both producers, plants or phytoplankton or algae, and other organisms and animals. So omnivores can be classified as a primary or a secondary consumer depending on what they choose to eat in a particular situation. Raccoons, brown bears, and humans are examples of omnivores. Organisms called detritivores and decomposers fill in the last rank of the food chain. Detritivores actually eat dead plants and animals and internally digest them. Think of an animal like a vulture or ordinary ants. They actually physically eat another decomposing animal. Decomposers, on the other hand, are organisms that break down the remains and wastes of other organisms. Fungi and bacteria are decomposers that don't need internal digestion to get their energy. And they're super important because they help return nutrients to the environment. Now that we have a basic grasp of the words that are used to describe organisms' place in the food chain, let's take a look at two food chains. On the right-hand side of this slide, we have a terrestrial food chain and an aquatic food chain. In this case, the aquatic food chain is a marine food chain because it is found in the sea. You can have other aquatic freshwater food chains in ponds, rivers, lakes, and so forth. So at the beginning of both food chains, as we do in every food chain, we have a producer. In the case of the terrestrial food chain, a plant. The plant is eaten by a primary consumer, or an herbivore, the grasshopper. The grasshopper is eaten by the mouse, which is a carnivore. We have a predator-prey relationship. The mouse is the predator, the grasshopper is the prey. And from here on out, the rest of the organisms are carnivores, whether they are tertiary consumers or third-level consumers like the snake, or quaternary level consumers, fourth-level consumers like the hawk. The marine food chain looks a little bit different, and we start off with phytoplankton, a term that you really do need to be familiar with. Often we're given food chains that we're not familiar with, and so it's good to know what organisms are. The secondary consumer in the marine food chain is zooplankton, microscopic animals that eat microscopic photosynthetic algae and plants, phytoplankton. And then you have the predator-prey relationship that occurs between the zooplankton and the herring. Herring are the predators, so they eat their prey, the zooplankton. And just as in the terrestrial food chain, from here on out we have carnivores. The tuna, a larger fish, eats the herring, and the killer whale eats the tuna. One important vocabulary term that we didn't mention in the last slide is the term apex predator. So at the top of every food chain, apex means at the top, you have an apex predator. In the terrestrial food chain, the apex predator would be the hawk, and in the marine food chain, the apex predator would be the killer whale. Another very important vocabulary term that we'll look at in the next slide as well is this idea of trophic levels. We've been using the terms producers, primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers. Those terms refer to the organism's trophic level. Producers are in the first trophic level, primary consumers are in the second trophic level, secondary consumers are in the third trophic level. One thing that students often get confused about is they talk about the third trophic level, which is secondary consumers. So because a secondary consumer, it seems like it should be in the second trophic level. Just be aware that tertiary consumers are in the fourth trophic level, because the first level is always your plants or phytoplankton or algae, photosynthetic organisms that produce their own energy. Autotrophs, as we learned in the last slide. All right, the big skill that you need to be able to have is to look at a food web, which is an interconnected series of food chains. So this terrestrial food chain doesn't represent the complete picture. For example, a mouse may eat a grasshopper, but mice are omnivores that also be happy to eat certain plants. So this does not describe how the mouse gets its energy completely. One important reminder from the 7th grade. In a food web and a food chain, the arrows represent the flow of energy. Algae gets its energy from the sun. Snails get their energy from algae. Sunfish get their energy from the snails. Often there's a misconception that students have, especially when they don't know the organisms that are in the food chain. For example, you might not know what a sunfish is, and you think it might be reasonable that a sunfish eats a bass. For some reason, students often confuse the arrow, and they believe that the arrow points to what is being eaten. It's the other way around. The arrow itself points to where that organism gets its energy. So it is the bass that is eating the sunfish and obtaining energy from the sunfish. Notice that you have multiple food chains. When you're looking at a food web, you need to be able to track multiple food chains. For example, we could start with energy going to the producer algae and then follow another food chain, algae to minnows and minnows to bass and bass to snapping turtles. Food webs give a complete picture of how the different organisms relate to each other in their quest for energy. You do need to be able to look at individual organisms. For example, this snapper turtle right here. Clearly, there are no arrows pointing away from the snapping turtle, so there's nothing in this food web that is consuming it. It's the apex predator. You need to be able to describe it as such. If we look at steps in the food chain, right, you have algae consuming snails, and then snails being eaten by sunfish, making the sunfish a secondary consumer and the snails a primary consumer. If the snapping turtle eats the sunfish, that apex predator can be described as a tertiary consumer. We could also describe it as a carnivore because it eats no producers. It only eats sunfish and bass. Let's take a look at one more. If we highlight minnows, or let's get, is there anything that eats both producers and other organisms? No, it looks like we just have straight primary consumers. No omnivores in this food web. You notice we have insect larvae, but the only thing they're eating are producers, algae. But if we take a look at the insect larvae, we could describe them using the terms that we've learned. The insect larvae are primary consumers because their only food source is producers, in this case, algae.